Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 571, The Revolutionary, Part 6. It was a warm summer night in 1972 in the ritzy Akasaka neighborhood of Tokyo when a member of Japan's parliament made a suggestion to Miyazaki Manabu. That suggestion, in keeping with the dignity of Japan's foremost house of the people, the representative organ in which the sovereign power of the nation was invested, was, of course, to go see a strip show. The Diet man in question was Okuda Keiwa, at the time a first-term representative from Ishikawa Prefecture, having recently made the jump up from a position in the local prefectural assembly to national politics. Miyazaki, of course, was there for work, doing his best to cover politics, which then and still now is pretty hard to do if you are not part of the more established journalistic set in Japan. But let me back up actually for a second. I should explain why that's the case, which means it's time to talk about the Kisha Kurabu and what they have to do with strip clubs. Now that term just means reporters club. You sometimes hear it called a press club, and the image it tends to conjure is some nice, tastefully appointed room where journalists sit around sipping good scotch and pondering the nature of the Fourth Estate and its responsibilities to the people and society. But if you know what the reporters' clubs actually are, you know it's not quite that. The origins of the Kisha Kurabu go all the way back to the 1890s, when the original authoritarian constitution of the Japanese Empire gave the state substantial power to restrict the freedom of the press or free speech in general. Article 29 of that constitution did provide freedom of speech, but like so many other rights, quote, within the limits provided by law. The limit here were specifically controlled press clubs who, in return for their good reporting, that is to say reporting what the government wanted, got privileged access to government press conferences and the like. It was basically a simple trade. Access to the news as it was happening in exchange for compliance with how the government wanted the news spun. The post-war government was supposed to be, and in many ways is, more transparent than the imperial state, but the reporters' clubs have endured. Ostensibly, they are just social organizations that allow reporters to network. I believe, though for some reason I have never personally been invited, there actually are tastefully appointed rooms for them all to drink scotch in. I'm sure my invitation is on the way any day now. The thing is, the government still uses the reporters' clubs to restrict access. Direct interviews with the Prime Minister are restricted to those who are in the Prime Minister's Reporters Club, and with the Diet to the National Diet Press Club, and so on. These clubs can be enormously influential. They're the main way reporters get access to political elites. And the press clubs decide their own membership, which means they can do a lot to exclude journalists who don't meet their standards. Maybe they're worried about those journalists reporting on a bunch of dirty laundry and getting them all barred from press conferences. Maybe they just don't like those upstarts. How important it is, of course, is debatable. More than a few journalists and scholars have noted the main thing reporters' clubs are good for is getting highly manicured press releases from political functionaries who've been very carefully instructed not to say too much. You won't get the real story in a reporters' club if they don't want to give it. And as Miyazaki himself put it, quote, in such an environment, reporters gradually equate reporting with receiving news supplied by the government, unquote. In other words, it's not really reporting at all. But still, for a paper like Shukan Gendai, a lack of access to politicians was an issue, given that people looked to them for disruptive, interesting coverage. And so Miyazaki and his fellow reporters were tasked with finding ways to access politicians outside of the press clubs. And that brings us back to Dietman Okuda Keiwa and his strip club. Okuda was born in 1927, and so he was 18 years older than Miyazaki. However, like Miyazaki, he'd studied at Waseda and flirted with communist student groups before graduating and becoming a reporter, in his case for a local paper in his native Ishikawa Prefecture. He'd been influential enough at his paper to land a position as head of their union, and from there was able to jump into politics, but not as a communist. You see, by this time, either out of sincere conversion or pure cynicism, he'd become a conservative and joined the reigning Liberal Democratic Party, first aiming at local politics and then national. but he was still fond of young student radicals, reporters, and his fellow Waseda alumni, which was why when Miyazaki reached out to him to talk, he was willing. Miyazaki talks a great deal about the ways in which his relationship with Okuda, who would remain quite close to him, proved very important to his political access and ability to understand what was happening in the back rooms of power. For example, the two met initially in 1972. Actually, very early in the summer, it apparently only took a week for Dietman Okuda to suggest the strip club, so clearly he really liked Miyazaki. This meant that they met in the middle of one of the biggest political happenings of the era, a rift within the Liberal Democratic Party known as the Tanaka-Fukuda War. This was the conflict within the party's leadership over who would take over when, in 1972, the long-standing party president and prime minister Sato Eisaku finally stepped down. Sato had dominated the party since 1964 and had only been stopped from running for a fourth term as party president, and thus prime minister, because by this time the LDP was winning every election, so realistically whoever ran it was the prime minister, by what were called the three Nixon shocks: opening relations with communist China without warning the Japanese in advance, putting a 10% tariff on foreign goods without warning the Japanese in advance, and taking the US off the gold standard, ending a fixed system of exchange rates that Japan relied on for its export market. Sato took the fall for not seeing these things coming, and with his approval numbers plummeting, he resigned. The question then became who would take over for him. The LDP, like most large political parties, has a bunch of internal factions in it. Like in many parties, these factions are kind of ideological, but in Japan specifically, they're also very personal, based largely on a sort of patronage system where faction leaders use their pull to help fund the campaigns of supporters in exchange for their personal loyalty. The two faction leaders best positioned to whip votes to become the new leader were the factions led by Tanaka Kakue and Fukuda Takeo. Shukan Gendai wanted to know who was going to win and tasked Miyazaki with trying to get the inside scoop. That's how he met Okuda, a politician who was deeply cynical and very in it for himself by all accounts. He'd actually gotten his start as a part of Prime Minister Sato's faction, but once Sato resigned, he immediately jumped over to the faction of the man he expected to win the leadership battle, Tanaka Kakue. And he was right, Tanaka did win, and Okuda, with his background as a journalist, was able to dig into the views of his colleagues and predict almost exactly to the number how the votes would shake out. It was actually to celebrate how good his predictions had been, apparently, that he ended up suggesting the strip club. Okuda and Tanaka are really good examples in turn of the political shifts of the 70s as Miyazaki and really wider Japanese society experienced them. The re-establishing of order and stability, the solidification of the new consumer society. Of course, those of you who know the name Tanaka Kakue might be surprised to hear me mention him in the same breath as order and stability, because if you know anything about him, it's probably that he is famous for being one of, if not the most corrupt politician in Japanese history, and given that we are talking about a country that has not, so far as I'm aware, gone without a major corruption scandal for more than a couple of years since like the 1950s at the earliest, that's really saying something. Fully doing justice to the absolutely ludicrous corruption of the Tanaka faction would be impossible to do here, but I want to give you some idea of the scope of the man's, let's call them ambitions, because I do think it's helpful for understanding the period's politics. Tanaka became prime minister in 1972, but would only stay in office until 1974, when a whole raft of corruption scandals saw him get the boot. Just to touch on one of these, it came out that he had spent $500,000 at the time on designer ties to give as gifts to state bureaucrats responsible for evaluating and implementing his policies. Supposedly, the extent of his gifts, and that's how they were always couched to provide some cover against being called bribes, were to such an extent that he bankrupted the LDP or came pretty close to it. That wasn't even the end of it. In 1976, when he was the ex-prime minister, he was embroiled in the massive Lockheed bribery scandal when it came out that the US firm Lockheed Martin had paid bribes to Tanaka, set up by a Tanaka acquaintance, the Yakuza boss Kodama Yoshio, and several other key government figures to get contracts. Tanaka was indicted and convicted on corruption charges, but appealed, continued to win elections in the meantime, and literally kept appealing until he died while the trial was still going in 1993. Part of the reason he could do this was the very effective staff he surrounded himself with, led by Hayasaka Shigezo, Tanaka's senior secretary who managed his public relations, and steadfastly froze out everyone who was not in his boss's preferred reporters' clubs. This meant Tanaka could very effectively control the story surrounding himself, and Hayasaka could freeze out any bad press that would engage in frivolous reporting, which is to say telling the truth about what Tanaka had done. Incidentally, Hayasaka Shigezo was actually also a Waseda graduate and also a former communist. Quite a few former supporters of the radical left in the 40s and 50s had by the 60s and 70s transitioned toward conservatism, perhaps foreshadowing what would happen to many of the radicals of the 60s and 70s. They were disillusioned by the failures of the left parties and drawn to the successes of the conservatives in strengthening the country. At any rate, the fact that Tanaka was so hard to get the inside scoop on made the relationship Miyazaki had with Okuda Keiwa, who liked Miyazaki enough to give him access to, for example, his personal files on the support Tanaka had within the LDP, or even just pay the young reporter's bar tabs because he liked the kid, very useful. And yes, if you're wondering, by the way, they did end up going to the strip club together, but only after Okuda, at Miyazaki's suggestion, removed the lapel pin that identified him as a member of the National Diet. Okuda would provide Miyazaki with great access to the inner workings of the LDP, so much so that Hayashi Shigezo would at one point corner the reporter and demand to know who his source was. Miyazaki, of course, refused as a matter of journalistic integrity to say, though my understanding is that those rules also prevent you from having your sources pay for your drinks or take you to a strip club, but I guess I've never been a journalist. That access to the inner workings of the party would be invaluable because Tanaka Kakue represented a pretty fundamental change in Japanese politics. The men who had dominated the LDP for the last decade and a half before Tanaka had been very different types of leaders from him. The ultra-nationalist Prime Minister Kishi Nobusuke was famous for his koshise, his high posture, his haughty affect and persona. His successor Ikeda Hayato had taken the exact opposite approach, the teishise, the low posture, famous for his folkishness and approachability. To be fair, that might have been an act. Arguably, in the early 50s, he had a public image that was much more calloused and elitist and cleaned it up to become prime minister, but whole other question. Then there was Sato Eisaku, who was maybe not the nicest. He was willing to unleash riot cops on protesting students throughout the 60s, for example, but at least publicly presented himself as a selfless public servant who worked to guarantee Japan's growing status as an economic power. All of them, that is to say, acted like traditional politicians, either a little bit haughty and elitist or playing the role of a public servant. But then Tanaka Kakue became prime minister, and there's a great story about him that I think illustrates the changes of Japanese politics in the 70s. So it's July 1972. Tanaka has just won the presidency of the LDP. He's now prime minister. Of course, he has a big celebration as a part of this, during which two young girls come up to Tanaka and give him bouquets of flowers. He accepts the bouquets, he thanks the girls, and then he reaches into his wallet and gives both of the girls a 10,000 yen note. That's not a lot of money. That'd be about $33 by the 1972 exchange rate, about $250 today, but it's not chump change for a young kid either. If as a 10-year-old some adult had handed me $250, I would have thought I was rich. And so quite a few reporters criticized Tanaka for what they called a crash gesture on his part. This was his public response, quote, "It's my belief that after life itself, the most important thing in this world is money. Today is the happiest day of my life. On such an occasion, what's wrong with giving the second most important thing to those little girls?" And the thing is, I imagine in normal political circumstances that might have been at least divisive. I mean, a politician literally handing someone cash is certainly complex, to say the least. But nobody really responded to it, or, as Miyazaki put it, quote, "Tanaka's realism mirrored something in the general public. Otherwise, people would not have greeted the administration of this down-to-earth politician with as much enthusiasm as they did." Maybe, in other words, Tanaka was just right. After the political exhaustion of the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the battles over the future of Japan, maybe everyone had just decided that getting rich, building the consumer society we talked about last week, was just the point of life. Of course, this new reality came with its own price. The wild pursuit of wealth, as anyone familiar with the post-war era knows, enabled a volume of corruption of which Tanaka was but a small part and which would eventually implode under its own weight, but that was a long way off in the 70s. Things were still riding high at this point, at least for most people. Miyazaki would enjoy his heady life as a reporter, though before long he did get himself fired for trying to unionize his fellow beat reporters, all of whom were contractors. The ownership group for their paper, taken over by Kodansha, was not interested in dealing with that. But he was comfortable enough, he'd even been able to buy a house for himself. But once again, Miyazaki was at a loss, at least until 1975, because in that year, his brother reached out to him again. You might remember that the Teramuragumi, the Yakuza family Miyazaki Manabu had been born into, was back in Kyoto, a fairly minor family as these things went, and at least the last time Miyazaki had seriously engaged with it was back in 1965 when he left for college after getting money from his dad. But in 1975, the elder brother, Tsuneo, had been running the more or less legitimate side of the family business for a few years. He'd taken direct control of Teramura Kensan, the construction side of the family business that was, well, again, not legitimate, but more above board than some other activities. Now, neither Miyazaki Manabu nor his brother Tsuneo was the Oyabun, the head of the Teramuragumi. That had been given to another subordinate who was more familiar with the illegal side of the family business. But Teramura Kensan, even though it was a legitimate corporation, was still heavily tied to, financed by, and of course staffed by Teramuragumi and family members. Essentially, it was a combination of a money laundering operation for their illegal activities and an actual revenue stream. Under Miyazaki Tsuneo's management, Teramura Kensan had flourished for a while. But by 1975, Japan was approaching a recession. Like the rest of the world, the 70s oil embargo had hit it hard, and the age of super high 10% annual GDP growth rates was receding. To make matters worse, the previous management of Teramura Kensan had been, well, Yakuza. And Yakuza are known for many things, but traditionally, particularly among the smaller gangs, wealth management was not a strong suit. Both Miyazaki's father and brother were apparently infamous for using the phrase better dead than stingy, which is not what you want to hear from someone responsible for a budget. Apparently at one point they blew 40 million yen just on an all-expenses company trip to Europe. And so, somehow, by 1975, Teramura Kensan was 20 million yen in debt. That would be about $67,000 US at the time, about $394,000 today, just for reference. Fortunately for them, they were kind of related to someone who could help. Miyazaki Manabu had technically studied economics at one of the most prestigious universities in Japan. He'd never really went to class, but you can't become a Marxist without knowing at least a little economic theory, right? And that was the plan for why Miyazaki Manabu's family came to him in their hour of need, and he ended up running the company into the ground. I won't bury the lead here. Things went very poorly. Why? Well, part of it had to do with an important part of the construction industry called dango, or bid rigging. We covered this back in the first episode of the miniseries because the practice itself is old. I'm actually not sure how old it is, but basically dango is a way of bidding on construction contracts. That bidding process is theoretically simple. You get a bunch of quotes, pick the cheapest one, the same way you would if you're getting work done on your home. The purpose of the approach is to drive down prices for the consumer, which is good for them, but bad for construction companies. So companies engaged in a process called bid rigging, particularly around government contracts, which were very pricey and lucrative. The process, in essence, involved agreeing on the bids behind the scenes between the competing companies, predetermining who would win, and rotating the winning position to ensure everyone got a taste, and that nobody undercut the others so that everyone could keep prices high. As a part of this, the winning company would usually give a small portion of the contract to the losers, so to speak, to keep them financially afloat in the interim. Miyazaki, however, had no time or patience for this system. This is when he first starts calling himself a toppamono, literally a person who breaks through, but apparently in Kansai dialect, it's literally a phrase for bullheadedness or a stubborn person. I never learned Kansai dialect. I have no idea if that's still common use. So, for example, Miyazaki would repeatedly refuse to lose the contracts in the behind-the-scenes negotiations, refusing to do any bid rigging and often forcing local negotiators, usually from other Yakuza families, to mediate. That usually involved either Miyazaki just getting the contract or receiving a higher cut of the final price in exchange for backing down. He would also do things like just lie about the value of the contracts he did win, for example, to recycle old movie studios closed by the recession, including some of the lots run by Daiei, which had been owned by his father's old friend Nagata Masaichi. That involved a bunch of things like pulling up the wiring on sets to scrap and recycle. Miyazaki was supposed to, in exchange for winning those contracts, pay kickbacks to all the other scrapping companies which had bet on the project based on the final value of what he got. That's the bid rigging process. But he just lied about how much money he made and gave them peanuts. And that's the sort of trick that works once or twice. Eventually, of course, he became very unpopular both with his competition and the other local Yakuza. I'm kinda surprised he didn't get beaten up. I'm assuming his own Yakuza connections were the reason why. It still meant that before long, nobody wanted to work with him. Equally, let's say, challenging for his popularity was Miyazaki's treatment of one of the other big issues of the construction industry, tenants' rights groups. You see, Japan has pretty strict tenant protections, a legacy of the occupation era and the reforms it introduced. Among other things, it makes it very hard to redevelop a piece of land. If even a single tenant doesn't want to move out of, say, apartments you want to build a skyscraper on, you, my friend, are SOL. It's even harder if they outright own the land. And that's why a lot of construction companies relied on pressuring tenants to move, sometimes with money, sometimes with promises of help relocating, or if that didn't work, with Yakuza paid to do something called jiageya. Now, this is essentially helping to make real estate deals that would raise prices in order to help construction firms make money. The practice of jiageya is most associated with the 80s, but it goes back through the whole post-war era, and involves creative approaches to harassing tenants into leaving their homes, such as, and these are all real, dumping poisonous centipedes into a building, driving dump trucks into said building, or blasting music 24/7 to make it impossible to sleep. All of that's pretty heinous, of course, but it's too indirect for our friend Miyazaki Manabu. He preferred, shockingly enough, to take the more direct approach of simply taking his toughest guys down to a site to beat the ever-loving hell out of the holdouts. In one case, Miyazaki ran into trouble with a neighborhood association after taking on a contract to demolish a public building, which was right by a nearby school, leading the local PTA, the Parent-Teacher Association, to complain about potential dust and vibration disturbing classes. They got an injunction to stop him with the support of none other than the Kyoto Communist Party. Miyazaki, of course, responded to all of this in the calm and reasonable way that matched what we know of his style of management, by which I mean he told the PTA and the communists to shove it where the rising sun don't shine, and then told his men to just start bulldozing the site anyway, and when the cops showed up to try and stop him, he said basically, "Arrest me or I won't," and somehow he didn't get arrested. Too much paperwork, I guess. This aggressive approach did briefly revive the fortunes of Terumaru Kensan, but there was a flip side to this, of course. Before long, other construction companies refused to collaborate with him on bid rigging, essentially freezing him out of public contracts as a system. Word got out that Miyazaki was efficient, but he tended to piss off a lot of people and leave a lot of legal trouble in his wake. And before long, things started to spiral, and attempts to collect on old debts or find new contracts to bring Terumaru Kensan back to life proved harder and harder. By early 1980, the family business was staring down the barrel of bankruptcy. By the late 70s, the Japanese economy was starting to recover and move out of recession, but by that point it mattered a lot less because Miyazaki's problem wasn't the economy, but the reputation he'd made for himself. And then in the summer of 1980, the cops put out a warrant for Miyazaki and his brother. The charge was defrauding another contractor, Sato Kogyo, out of 12 million yen, just under $53,000 at the time, about $217,000 today. Now, that's not chump change. I would certainly love to have $217,000 to throw around, but compared to the volume of money at play in your average construction contracts millions of dollars at the time, let alone today, it kinda was chump change. But the police had come across evidence tying Miyazaki and his brother to this admittedly minor extortion case as a part of a much wider-ranging crackdown on organized crime in the Kyoto area. A series of major blowups over Yakuza-related crime tied to construction, specifically siphoning money away from the public sector, had led prefectural police to organize a special task force to combat organized crime in construction, with orders to dig up whatever they could. At the start, neither Miyazaki brother was actually a target. Neither one was running the illegal side of the Teramura Gumi at the time, after all, but when another Yakuza caught up in police raids around the case let slip that he had evidence tying the two Miyazakis to a fraud case, well, the fact was, in the scope of the investigation, it wasn't a big deal, but it was enough for a warrant, and in Japan's extremely strict court system, that probably meant enough for a conviction, which was enough to slap on a press release to show the investigations were working. And besides, both Miyazakis might not have been active Yakuza, but they were known as children of an Oyabun, so the value of pinning something on both of them in terms of PR was hard to pass up. The specific allegation was that in October 1979, both Miyazakis had defrauded Sato Kogyo, a contractor working in the Yamashina ward of Kyoto, which was being harassed by local Yakuza, specifically the Maruoka family, for protection money. The Miyazakis had served as intermediaries, helping the company negotiate with those Yakuza, and told the company that a 12 million yen gift to the Yakuza in consideration for their protection would be enough to settle the issue. The accusation was that the brothers then pocketed the money. Now, the Miyazaki brothers never denied that all this happened, but they say they didn't pocket the money. They passed it on to the Maruoka family as requested, and even got a thank you note from Sato Kogyo. A company employee even witnessed the whole handover so he could vouch that it all went through. But the police wanted that conviction and started pressuring Sato Kogyo's leadership to testify against the Miyazakis, on pain, so the informal demand went, of never getting a public contract again if they wouldn't cooperate. Now, Miyazaki, of course, didn't take this lying down. In particular, after the warrant went out, he sat down with a friend of his at the local branch of the Yomiuri Shimbun, a major national daily. That friend had been a colleague at Shukan Gendai, but moved on to something more respectable. There, Miyazaki outlined his side of the story, essentially accusing the police and prosecutors of an unfairly motivated prosecution and also extreme incompetence, while giving his colleague a lot of salacious details about the nature of the construction industry. The article ran on the front page the day Miyazaki turned himself into the cops to be arrested. Now, getting arrested in Japan is bad. We've covered this before, but the country has much less strict habeas corpus laws than the US does. You can be held for weeks without charges. By comparison, in the US, you either have 2 or 3 days before you need to be charged or let go. Well, in these long detentions, Japanese cops are infamous for using a variety of dubiously legal or overtly illegal means to extract confessions being the main way one gets convicted of basically anything in Japan, an interesting cultural holdover in terms of police procedure from the age of the Confucian-derived samurai bureaucrats who made up the pre-modern policing force, and who were obsessed with confession as an idea, a way to rectify wrongdoing. Of course, Miyazaki wasn't going to concess. He insists, even down to his dying day, that he was totally innocent. Again, not that he didn't act as an intermediary, he just rejected the claim he pocketed the money. Of course, we're talking about crime here, and a guy who, as we're starting to see, maybe he's doing a little exaggerating about his life. We can't take it all at face value, particularly because Miyazaki's repeated refusal to talk to the cops at all, and even mocking them during interrogations, really pissed them off. In fact, Miyazaki used his friend at the Yomiuri to preload a bunch of stories about the case before turning himself in, which were then released serially while he was being detained, essentially controlling the public narrative so the police had to respond to it, rather than being able to hold him while they controlled the story about his detention. This really annoyed a lot of people in the police force, and of course the cops couldn't actually pin anything on Miyazaki, and so eventually he was, by early August, released without charges. Whether or not he did break the law, and to be frank, it seems pretty clear he skirted it by helping a Yakuza group extort a company, but I'm not sure he broke it. He didn't get jailed. But he still paid a price. He drew the ire of the police, which is not a great idea when you run a company that is barely afloat already. Teramura Kensan had been kept aloft because its meager income did provide it with some creditworthiness, so it could take out some loans to make ends meet while waiting for contracts. But once the two Miyazaki brothers were out of prison, the lending dried up. Nobody wanted to deal with someone who, the thinking went, had annoyed the cops so much, it was only a matter of time before they pinned something else on him and sent him back to prison. Which is in fact what ended up happening. We'll get there. And so Miyazaki, after a few months of desperate pleading with banks and relatives, found himself staring down the doors of financial ruin as Teramura Kensan closed its doors. I'll end this week with his recollection of his state of mind as Japan was entering the 1980s, the last boom decade. I think his words at this moment in his life also capture the age very well. In our capitalistic world, especially at the business end of the economy, money is the only power and the only means to express what you are. Your ability to assert yourself is proportionate to the amount of capital at your disposal. It is a world ruled by the logic of money, one in which all human activity is commoditized and converted into cash. Without money, you are headless, faceless, and have no personality, just something to be brushed aside. It's the same as being penniless in the Ginza nightclub district. With no money, you are nobody. Society is no different. As soon as your money is gone, society isolates you and ceases to regard you as an individual. The only difference in business and underworld circles is that this is expressed more bluntly and taken to extremes. If you have money trouble, it is not just seen as managerial incompetence. It is the collapse of your very foundations as a human being. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. For more of this week's show and any of our other shows, check out facingbackward.com, and you can support the network on Patreon. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for the penultimate part, Part 7.